Alright, that's it. I'm officially convinced BAM Entertainment was physically incapable of publishing a good video game. I've only looked at a handful of games on my channel at this point in its lifespan, but the majority of Cartoon Network games that I've talked about so far have featured that stupid BAM Entertainment logo, and every single one that has been remarkably bad. Relish Rampage, Ed, Edd n Eddy Jawbreakers, the Game Boy Color trilogy of Powerpuff Girls games, they're all pretty forgettable, and honestly at first I was decently positive towards Relish Rampage, but in retrospect I think I talked that game up a little bit more than I probably should have to make it sound better than it is. Yeah, my thoughts have certainly changed since that initial review, and I would definitely go a lot harder on it than I did back then. The only BAM Entertainment game I've played that came across as being decently well put together was Dexter's Lab Disaster Strikes on the Game Boy Advance, and that one had a game-breaking glitch in its initial release that made it physically impossible to complete the game, so ultimately I feel that's kinda moot because there were still glaring problems anyways. The more of these early Cartoon Network video games I begin to play, the more BAM's incompetence begins to shine through. Will I ever find a genuinely good game produced by this company before it shut down and went into dormancy? Well, it certainly won't be today, because for today's video, I took some time to get into Samurai Jack once again and gave the Game Boy Advance title, The Amulet of Time, a shot for the first time in my life. And I tell you what, this is one of the most disappointing video games I've ever played. In terms of potential, that is, not hype or anticipation. The game was developed by VirtueCraft, the same team that actually made Disaster Strikes, although this would be their final Cartoon Network game they ever produced. Samurai Jack follows the titular character after getting sent 50 years into the future by Aku, a cruel shogun manifested as evil incarnate who wishes to rule the planet and maintain a total world power, causing all of culture and society to suffer underneath his reign. Throughout the series, Jack meets a wide array of different characters and faces a multitude of challenges along his journey to vanquish Aku from the realm once and for all. And with this game having been released in 2003, the first 2 seasons of the show and half of season 3 had already been released by this point in time, so the series was well established. Samurai Jack, The Amulet of Time can best be described as a metroid-vania clone with the Samurai Jack elements and aesthetics. Practically everything about the way this game is designed takes inspiration straight out of Samus Aran's book. Hidden power-ups located around the world, a map that shows you all the rooms you've been to in a grid-like structure, a pause menu that shows you your current statistics where you equip armor, a set of elemental sword attacks that unlock as you progress throughout the game, save rooms that you come across every so often that allow you to save your progress, the whole shebang. Of course, I don't want to call this an outright ripoff because it does have its own levels and story going on here. It's not just Metroid Fusion starring a foolish samurai warrior wielding a magic sword. But a Metroid-inspired Samurai Jack video game sounds like a great idea, and I'm all for something like that if it's done well. It just wasn't in this case. Let's start with the story, as I usually do when it comes to these game reviews. Samurai Jack The Amulet of Time begins with Jack seen training with some monks in a temple somewhere, helping him hone his skills so that he may eventually take down the evil Aku, the Shogun of Sorrow. It is during this training that one of the monks shows Jack the Amulet of Time, a special item with the possibility of sending Jack back in time to whence he came before Aku had ever taken over and ruled the land. However, in order to use this power, Jack must first travel across the land, finding the 4 elemental gems needed in order to power the amulet so that he may travel back in time. From that point, the game opens up as Jack travels down the mountainside to fight some spider robots while the story takes a backseat until the very end of the game. It's pretty much just a free-for-all at this point as Jack spends the entire time getting those 4 elemental gems in order to activate the power of the amulet, although the occasional side plot pops up every now and then, whether it be to help save this girl from capture or assist the Rob Paulson dog from the first 3 episodes of the series. Once again, this is kinda to be expected given the Metroid-styled gameplay, and given Jack's quiet nature, it makes sense that he wouldn't have much to say in the way of dialogue, so at the very least it's accurate to the show. Eventually, at the end of the game, Jack meets up with Bob here, who is able to translate the markings on the amulet to read that the amulet can only work in a very specific location, that being the top of Aku's control tower. So Jack travels up there to fight Aku, but ultimately fails to return home because, That's how it always goes. Take it from me, I love Samurai Jack, and at the very least I can say there are some cool nods to the show present here between the enemy varieties that you end up fighting to the NPCs that you help along the way. And of course, the settings are very much faithful to the Samurai Jack art style with some pretty impressive sprite work at play here too. Honestly, if there's one thing I can give handheld BAM entertainment games, it's that the sprite work is usually pretty good. I love the way the different environments mimic the art style of the show, and especially towards the end of the game when you get ready to start taking on Aku and end up going to Neo Tokyo. Samurai Jack's sprites themselves are particularly eye-catching, especially with all of the different sword animations that he gets, and some of the enemy movements appear to be way more smooth than they have any right being on a Game Boy Advance. If I were to rate this game solely on presentation, I'd give it an A, because the environment design and the puzzles that are present within the game really do provide for an engaging experience, and the combat against most enemies can be rather satisfying at points with the rapid-fire sword swings you're capable of performing. The combat in the game is designed like you would kind of expect a beat-em-up or fighting game to be, where the direction you hold while you press the attack button as well as how many times you press it determines the moves that you perform. For instance, you can perform a quick succession of jab attacks by just pressing the B button a few times, but if you hold the direction you're currently facing, you'll do a stronger forward slash that deals more damage, or you can perform an upward strike if you're holding up. You get the idea. Now, I say that the combat in this game can be fun, and here's where I'm going to start getting into all of the negative aspects of this game that really let me down as I kept continuing on. Unfortunately, for the Amulet of Time, Jack's control is unbearably stiff, which makes combat and platforming excruciatingly annoying at points when you're just trying to be precise. This game decided to take a note from Castlevania instead of Metroid when it came to jumping mechanics because, unlike the latter, once Jack is up in the air, any mid-air control is practically non-existent, which makes changing your momentum nigh impossible once you've left the ground. And the worst part is that Jack's jump distance is so incredibly momentum-based that you basically have to have the exactly correct speed before you jump, otherwise you're not making it. If you're running too fast, you could outright overshoot a platform, but if you're going too slow, you don't even have a chance. And what makes jumping even more annoying is that every single time you jump, the entire screen gets this compelling desire to shake when he lands. Every time. Like, my god, this is headache-inducing. Top that off with some clunky ground movement and hitboxes where you swear you hit an enemy but you just don't because the sprite work doesn't match the hitboxes in the game's code, and things quickly melt down faster than butter in a microwave. I honestly don't see how anybody could play this and not get distracted by the consistent screen shake every 6 seconds, but then again, I'm not everybody. I'll just speak for myself when I say that I don't get motion sickness, but I still get distracted by this because I find it very hard to believe Jack has so much mass that him just landing on the ground causes the entire world around him to vibrate in response. And this game really harkens into the Metroid style of gameplay because, unlike most platformers where you would expect to jump with the A button and attack with the B button, the Amulet of Time is reversed. That's right. Now, if you want to jump, you actually have to press the B button to do so, and use the A button to attack with your sword. I don't know what it is, but I just can't get used to this button scheme based on the fact that Samurai Jack is a more close combat sword fighter rather than a long-range projectile shooter. If you're an avid Metroid fan, this isn't too much to get used to, but I can definitely see this throwing off a lot of new players who may not be familiar with this style of game, seeing as most 2D platformers tend to encourage the A button as the primary jump button. At the very least, Jack's moveset does improve as you progress throughout the game, later unlocking a double jump and a charge jump for extra mobility. There's also a wall jump and a roll which you can use to navigate cramped spaces, so Jack still feels like a relatively nimble samurai when the momentum is being carried in your favor. It's just that running start that makes him feel super clunky and hard to get used to, especially because combat practically requires you to stay in roughly the same place with little room to move around because you can't travel through enemies in this game. There were many times where I tried to just skip past them but couldn't because they'd attack me when I'd jump over them and I'd get knocked backwards, so I was basically forced to fight a lot of the bigger enemies that I ever so desperately wanted to avoid. And you better believe that this happened a lot. And that brings me to my next point. Save your game often, because just like Metroid, if you die, you go right back to the last place you saved, meaning any progress you made within that time is completely gone. This happened to me when I fought the first boss of the game. I got really close to killing it, and then it just decimated me out of the blue, and I lost about 20 minutes of my life in getting defeated by it. Not the end of the world though, just gotta play a little more defensive, and by that I mean use the infinite health Game Shark code, because my gosh, this game is asking a lot from you when it comes to fighting some of the enemies. I wouldn't say this is a beginner-friendly game given how hard the first boss hits and the limited amount of health you have available to you at the start. Aside from his basic sword attacks, Jack also unlocks other special abilities as you progress through the game, coming in the form of special items like one bow and arrow that lets you shoot a ranged attack, a hammer which allows you to smash down these columns that block your path, and an ice shield of sorts that lets you block incoming projectiles. Each of these items have their uses, similar to how Revenge of the Flying Dutchman on Game Boy Advance had those 3 items that SpongeBob could obtain to give him extra moves and abilities as the game progressed. Jack also unlocks these special elemental sword attacks in the form of earth, fire, water, and air elements that you get when you defeat the corresponding boss of that element in the game. Although the problem with these attacks, as I mentioned before, is that in order to activate them, you need to hold the attack button for an extended period of time in order to execute them, with the amount of time you charge determining the element that you use. This is perfectly fine when it comes to field traversal, but in combat it is virtually useless because whenever you put yourself in the charging stance, you immediately become vulnerable to all attacks without any ability to guard from incoming threats. And if you get even the slightest hit on you, the charge instantly drops and you're left having taken a chunk of damage with no attack to show for it. It's a high risk to take that I only find to be worth taking in boss fights, because at least there the boss has a considerable health bar to worry about. Regular enemies go down in a handful of sword swings anyways, so it's not really worth the trouble. I think one of the most interesting systems that the Amulet of Time introduces to its gameplay comes in the form of the items and equipment that Jack can acquire during his journey to defeat Aku. When you pause the game, a stat menu becomes visible, showing Jack's attack and defense stats against all of the various elements in the game. Throughout the world, there are these items and gems scattered about that enhances these features, like power rings that increase attack and gauntlets which deal additional damage to certain elemental enemies. And honestly, in concept, once again, Amulet of Time has something good going here. Unfortunately, and maybe it's just me, but I hardly noticed a difference when playing the game. It felt like enemies would take the same number of strikes to defeat whether I was wearing 2 power rings or none of them. Having the feature of elemental balancing adds strategy to the mix when it comes to fighting enemies and bosses that could be enjoyable, but the improvements seem so minute to me that it made me question if they were even present at all. Maybe they are, but again, I really didn't notice much difference. There's so little information available on this game that it's hard to tell what the damage and resistance multipliers are. It'd be nice to know for the sake of my own sanity, because I don't want to make an accusation that the multipliers in the game aren't present, which is why I'm stressing that there's such little difference that I've noticed when having them equipped versus unequipped. I really like a lot of the bosses in this game though, even if they can be rather annoying to fight given how agile and nimble they are while having crazy defenses and still being able to pack a punch. There's really cool monsters at play here, and I get a kick out of some of their designs, such as the Fire Demon and Ice Monster, and heck, the final boss fight with Aku is pretty fun too, seeing as he takes on his various animal transformations that were seen in the show. It's a good way of staying true to the boss fight while also taking advantage of the character's known abilities. Oh, surprise, surprise, Aku is the final boss of the game. I mean, considering that Aku is to Bowser as Jack is to Mario essentially, it just wouldn't feel right if he wasn't the final encounter of the game. And so, yes, after barely seeing him for the first 90% of the story, you finally get to take on Aku, only for Jack to be tricked at the last second and sent through time once again, this time without the amulet that he had worked so hard to achieve, kinda leaning into the Jawbreakers and Misadventures endings there with the status quo remaining the same, but I really don't think Gendy would want the ending of Samurai Jack to take place within this handheld Game Boy Advance title released in 2003 anyways, rather than addressing it in the show itself, so it makes sense. But still, needless to say, it's not a very exciting ending, one that most people would probably be able to predict even before playing the game. At the very least, I would have been willing to defend this aspect if the gameplay were actually a ton of fun, but unfortunately, that's not the case. I love the ideas at play here, I really do. It's just a shame that the end result ended up being as lackluster as it is, because this easily could be one of the greatest handheld licensed games ever if it just had some tweaking and better combat and control. The puzzles can be interesting and the map isn't confusing enough to get lost in. Like I said, I love the environments you get to explore, it's just that ultimately the execution is mediocre at best, and that leaves me with an incredibly empty, disappointing feeling. On the surface, the Amulet of Time has such an immense amount of promise, and if it had just gotten those key components right, this would easily be one of my most favorite Game Boy Advance titles of all time. But as I've said before, the control is the #1 thing I value in a video game above all else, and the control is one of the biggest detriments that prevents this game from being an enjoyable experience. Clunky jumping, clunky movement, clunky sword combat, clunky clunking. May as well change this game's title to the Amulet of Clunk. Anyways, that's gonna do it for my thoughts on the Amulet of Time. I wish the game was better than it is. Hopefully, the console title that was released around the same time is a better experience, but I guess we'll be finding out about that next time when I decide to dive in and tackle Samurai Jack: The Shadow of Aku for PlayStation 2 and Nintendo GameCube. Until next time, Shadowstreak, signing off.